Hi guys, we are learning Rishi Aurobindo's philosophies from his book The Life Divine, and today we start the 14th chapter called The Supermind as Creator. If you have been following my playlist on this book, you know that every chapter by Rishi Aurobindo starts with a quote from either any Veda or some Upanishad. For a change, this one starts with a quote from the Vishnu Puran. The quote says, "All things are self-deployings of the divine knowledge." The quote ends. Now Rishi Aurobindo writes, "A principle of active will and knowledge superior to mind and creatrix of the worlds is then the intermediary of power and state of being between that self-possession of the one and this flux of the many. This principle is not entirely alien to us. It does not belong solely and incommunicably to a being who is entirely other than ourselves or to a state of existence from which we are mysteriously projected into birth, but also rejected and unable to return. If it seems to us to be seated on heights far above us, yet are they the heights of our own being and accessible to our tread. We can not only infer and glimpse that truth, but we are capable of realizing it. We may, by a progressive expanding or a sudden luminous self-transcendence, mount up to these summits in unforgettable moments, or dwell on them during hours or days of greatest superhuman experience. When we descend again, there are doors of communication which we can keep always open or reopen even though they should constantly shut. But to dwell there permanently on this last and highest summit of the created and creative being is in the end the supreme ideal for our evolving human consciousness when it seeks not self-annulment but self-perfection. For as we have seen, this is the original idea and the final harmony and truth to which our gradual self-expression in the world returns and which it is meant to achieve. Still, we may doubt whether it is possible, now or at all, to give any account of this state to the human intellect or to utilize in any communicable and organizable way its divine workings for the elevation of our human knowledge and action. The doubt does not arise solely from the rarity or dubiety of any known phenomena that would betray a human working of this divine faculty, or from the remoteness which separates this action from the experience and verifiable knowledge of ordinary humanity. It is strongly suggested also by the apparent contradiction in both essence and operation between human mentality and the divine supermind. And certainly, if this consciousness had no relation at all to mind nor anywhere near any identity with the mental being, it would be quite impossible to give any account of it to our human notions. Or if it were in its nature only vision in knowledge and not at all dynamic power of knowledge, we could hope to attain by its contact a beatific state of beatific. We could hope to attain by its contact a beatific state of mental illumination, but not a greater light and power for the works of the world. But since this consciousness is creatrix of the world, it must be not only state of knowledge but power of knowledge, and not only a will to light and vision but a will to power and works. And since mind too is created out of it, mind must be a development by limitation out of this primal faculty and this mediatory act of the supreme consciousness, and must therefore be capable of resolving itself back into it through a reverse development by expansion. For always mind must be identical with supermind in essence and conceal in itself the potentiality of supermind, however different or even contrary it may have become in its actual forms and settled modes of operation. It may not then be an irrational or unprofitable attempt to strive by the method of comparison and contrast towards some idea of the supermind from the standpoint and in the terms of our intellectual knowledge. The idea, The terms may well be inadequate and yet still serve as a finger of light pointing us onward on a way which, to some distance at least, we may tread. Moreover, it is possible for mind to arise beyond itself into certain heights or planes of consciousness which receive into themselves some modified light or power of the supramental consciousness, and know that by an illumination, intuition, or a direct contact or experience, although to live in it and see and act from it is a victory that has not yet been humanly possible. And first we may pause a moment and ask ourselves whether no light can be found from the past which will guide us towards these ill-explored domains. We need a name and we need a starting point. For we have called this state of consciousness the supermind. But the word is ambiguous, since it may be taken in the sense of mind itself, supereminent and lifted above ordinary mentality, but not radically changed, or on the contrary, it may bear the sense of all that is beyond mind and therefore assume a too extensive comprehensiveness, which would bring in even the ineffable itself. A subsidiary description is required, which will more accurately limit its significance. It is the cryptic verses of the Veda that help us here, for they contain, though concealed, the gospel of the divine and immortal supermind, and through the veil some illumining, I forgot its pronunciation, illumining, yeah. It is the cryptic verses of the Veda that help us here, for they contain, though concealed, the gospel of the divine and immortal supermind, and through the veil some illumining flashes come to us. We can see through these utterances the conception of this supermind as a vastness beyond the ordinary firmaments of our consciousness, in which truth of being is luminously one with all that expresses it and assures inevitably truth of vision, formulation, arrangement, word, act and movement, and therefore truth also of result of movement, result of action and expression, infallible ordinance or law. Vast all-comprehensiveness, luminous truth and harmony of being in that vastness, and not a vague chaos or self-lost obscurity. Truth of law and act and knowledge expressive of that harmonious truth of being. These seem to be the essential terms of the Vedic description. The gods, who in their highest secret entity are powers of this supermind, born of it, seated in it as in their proper home, are in their knowledge quote-unquote truth conscious, and in their action possessed of the quote-unquote seer will, S-E-E-R will. Their conscious force turned towards works and creation is possessed and guided by a perfect and direct knowledge of the thing to be done and its essence and its law, a knowledge which determines a wholly effective willpower that does not deviate or falter in its process or in its result, but expresses and fulfills spontaneously and inevitably in the act that which has been seen in the vision. Light is here one with force, the vibrations of knowledge with the rhythm of the will, and both Light is here one with force, the vibrations of knowledge with the rhythm of the will, and both are one, perfectly and without seeking, groping or effort, with the assured result. The divine nature has a double power, a spontaneous self-formulation and self-arrangement which wells naturally out of the essence of the thing manifested and expresses its original truth, and a self-force of light inherent in the thing itself, and the source of its spontaneous and inevitable self-arrangement. There are subordinate but important details. The Vedic seers seem to speak of two primary faculties of the quote-unquote truth-conscious soul. They are sight and hearing, by which is intended direct operations of an inherent knowledge describable as truth vision and truth audition, and reflected from far off in our human mentality by the faculties of revelation and inspiration. Besides, a distinction seems to be made in the operations of the supermind between knowledge by a comprehending and pervading consciousness, which is very near to subjective knowledge by identity, and knowledge by a projecting, confronting, apprehending consciousness, which is the beginning of objective cognition. These are the Vedic clues, and we may accept from this ancient experience the subsidiary term truth consciousness to delimit the connotation of the more elastic phrase Supermind. So essentially truth consciousness. We see at once that such a consciousness described by such characteristics must be an intermediate formulation which refers back to a term above it and forward to another below it. We see at the same time that it is evidently the link and means by which the inferior develops out of the superior, and should equally be the link and means by which it may develop back again towards its source. The term above is the Unitarian or indivisible consciousness of pure Satchidananda, in which there are no separating distinctions. The term below is the analytic or dividing consciousness of mind, which can only know by separation and distinction, and has at most a vague and secondary apprehension of unity and infinity. Because though it can synthesize its divisions, it cannot arrive at a true totality. Between them is this comprehensive and creative consciousness, by its power of pervading and intimately comprehending knowledge, the child of that self-awareness by identity, which is the poise of the Brahman, and by its power of projecting, confronting, apprehending knowledge parent of that awareness by distinction, which is the process of the mind. Above, the formula of the One, eternally stable and immutable. Below, the formula of the Many, which eternally mutable, seeks but hardly finds in the flux of things a firm and immutable standing point. Between, the seat of all trinities, of all that is biune, of all that becomes many in one and yet remains one in many. Oh, what a great line. Of all that becomes many in one and yet remains one in many, because it was originally one that is always potentially many. Because it was originally one that is always potentially many. This intermediary term is therefore the beginning and end of all creation and arrangement, the alpha and the omega, the starting point of all differentiation, the instrument of all unification, originative, executive, and consummative of all realized or realizable harmonies. It has the knowledge of the One, but is able to draw out the One. It has the knowledge of the One, but is able to draw out of the One its hidden multitudes. It manifests the many, but does not lose itself in their differentiations. And shall we not say that its very existence points back to something beyond our supreme perception of the ineffable unity, something ineffable and mentally inconceivable, not because of its unity and indivisibility, but because of its freedom from even these formulations of our mind. Something beyond both unity and multiplicity, perhaps? Question mark is here. Something beyond both unity and multiplicity? That would be the utter absolute and real, which yet justifies to us both our knowledge of God and our knowledge of the world. But these terms are large and difficult to grasp. Thank God, he admits finally. But these terms are large and difficult to grasp. Let us come to precisions. We speak of the One as Satchidananda, but in the very description we posit three entities and unite them to arrive at a trinity. We say existence, consciousness, bliss, that is Sat, Chit and Ananda. We say existence, consciousness, bliss, and then we say they are one. It is a process of the mind. But for the Unitarian consciousness, such a process is inadmissible. Existence is consciousness and there can be no distinction between them. Consciousness is bliss and there can be no distinction between them. And since there is not even this differentiation, there can be no world. If that is the sole reality, then world is not and never existed, can never have been conceived. For indivisible consciousness is undividing consciousness and cannot originate division and differentiation. But this is a reductio ad absurdum, which means when you counter an argument by making it very simplistic and then making fun of that simplistic version of the original argument. We cannot admit it unless we are content to base everything upon an impossible paradox and an unreconciled antithesis. On the other hand, mind can conceive with precision divisions as real. It can conceive a synthetic totality or the finite extending itself as itself indefinitely, It can grasp aggregates of divided things. It can grasp aggregates of divided things and the sameness underlying them, but the ultimate unity and absolute infinity are to its conscience of things abstract notions and unsizable quantities, not something that is real to its grasp. much less something that is alone real. Here is therefore the very opposite term to the Unitarian consciousness. We have confronting the essential and indivisible unity, an essential multiplicity which cannot arrive at unity without abolishing itself, and in the very act confessing that it could never really have existed. Yet it was, because it is this that has found unity and abolished itself. And again we have a reductio ad absurdum, repeating the violent paradox which seeks to convince thought by stunning it, and the irreconciled and irreconcilable antithesis, which seeks to convince thought by stunning it, and the irreconciled and irreconcilable antithesis. The difficulty in its lower term disappears if we realize that mind is only a preparatory form of our consciousness. Mind is an instrument of analysis and synthesis, but not of essential knowledge. Its function is to cut out something vaguely from the unknown thing in itself, and call this measurement or delimitation of it the whole, and again to analyze the whole into its parts which it regards as separate mental objects. It is only the parts and accidents that the mind can see definitely and, after its own fashion, know. Of the whole, its only definite idea is an assemblage of parts or a totality of properties and accidents. The whole, not only seen as a part of something else or in its own parts, properties and accidents, is to the mind no more than a vague perception. Only when it is analyzed and put by itself as a separate constituted object or totality in a larger totality, can mind say to itself, "This now I know." And really it does not know. It knows only its own analysis of the subject and the idea it has formed of it by a synthesis of the separate parts and properties that it has seen. There its characteristic power, its sheer function ceases. Because he thinks he knows, but he doesn't know. He is merely assembling some information based on what he has seen around him. There its characteristic power, its sheer function ceases. And if we would have a greater, a profounder and a real knowledge, a knowledge and not an intense but formless sentiment, such as comes sometimes to certain deep but inarticulate parts of our mentality, which means you can think about it but not really explain to someone, inexplicable realities, as was mentioned in the book previously. A knowledge and not an intense but formless sentiment, such as comes sometimes to certain deep but inarticulate parts of our mentality. Mind has to make room for another consciousness which will fulfill mind by transcending it or reverse and so rectify its operations after leaping beyond it. The summit of mental knowledge is only a vaulting board from which that leap can be taken. The utmost mission of mind is to train our obscure consciousness, which has emerged out of the dark prison of matter, to enlighten its blind instincts, random intuitions, vague perceptions, till it shall become capable of this greater light and this higher ascension. Mind is a passage, not a culmination. A very important phrase. Mind is a passage, not a culmination. So it's not the end point. On the other hand, the Unitarian consciousness or indivisible unity cannot be that impossible entity, a thing without contents, out of which all contents have issued and into which they disappear and become annihilated. It must be an original self-concentration in which all is contained but in another manner than in this temporal and spatial manifestation. That which has thus concentrated itself is the utterly ineffable and inconceivable existence which the nihilist images to his mind as the negative void of all that we know and are, but the transcendentalist with equal reason may image to his mind as the positive but indistinguishable reality of all that we know and are. In the beginning, says the Vedanta, was the one existence without a second. But before and after the beginning, now, forever and beyond time, is that which we cannot describe even as the one, even when we say that nothing but that is. When we can be aware of what we can be aware of is, first, its original self-concentration, which we endeavor to realize as the indivisible one. Secondly, the diffusion and apparent disintegration of all that was concentrated in its unity, of all, the disintegration of all that was concentrated in its unity, which is the mind's conception of the universe. And thirdly, its firm self-extension in the truth consciousness, which contains and upholds the diffusion and which upholds the diffusion, contains the diffusion and as well upholds the diffusion, and prevents it from being a real disintegration, maintains unity in utmost diversity and stability in utmost mutability. What a great line. Maintains unity in utmost diversity and stability in utmost mutability, insists on harmony in the appearance of an all-pervading strife and collision, keeps eternal cosmos where mind would arrive only at a chaos eternally attempting to reform. Keep eternal cosmos where mind would arrive only at a chaos eternally attempting to form itself. This is the supermind, the truth consciousness, the real idea, which knows itself and all that it becomes. Supermind is the vast self-extension of the Brahman that contains and develops. By the idea it develops the triune principle of existence, consciousness and bliss out of their indivisible unity. So by the idea, capital letter I, by the idea, it develops the triune principle of existence, consciousness and bliss out of their indivisible unity. The supermind does it. It differentiates them, but it does not divide. Differentiates does not mean dividing someone. It establishes a trinity, not arriving like the mind from three to the one, but manifesting the three out of the one. For it manifests and develops, and yet maintaining them in the unity, because it knows and contains. By the differentiation, it is able to bring forward one or other of them as the effective deity, which contains the other involved or explicit in itself, and this process it makes the foundation of all other differentiations. And it acts by the same operation on all the principles and possibilities which it evolves out of this all-constituent trinity. It possesses the power of development, of evolution, of making explicit, and that power carries with it the other power of involution, of envelopment, of making implicit. In a sense, the whole of creation may be said to be a movement between two involutions, spirit in which all is involved and out of which all evolves downwards to the other pole of matter, and matter in which also all is involved and out of which all evolves upward to the other pole of spirit. Thus, the whole process of differentiation by the real idea creative of the universe is a putting forward of principles, forces, forms, which contain for the comprehending consciousness all the rest of existence within them, and front the apprehending consciousness with all the rest of existence implicit behind them. Therefore, all is in each as well as each is in all. All is in each is in all. Therefore, all is in each and as well as each in all. Therefore, every seed of things implies in itself all the infinity of various possibilities, but is kept to one law of process and result by the will, that is to say, by the knowledge force of the conscious being who is manifesting himself and who, sure of the idea in himself, predetermines we need to read the sentence again. Therefore, every seed of things implies in itself all the infinity of various possibilities, but is kept to one law of process and results by the will, that is to say, by the knowledge force of the conscious being who is manifesting himself and who, sure of the idea in himself, predetermines by it his own forms and movements. The seed is the truth of its own being, which is this self-existence sees in itself. The resultant of that seed of self-vision is the truth of self-action. The natural law of development, formation and functioning, which follows inevitably upon the self-vision and keeps to the processes involved in the original truth. All nature is simply then the seer will, the knowledge force of the conscious being at work, to evolve in force and form all the inevitable truth of the idea into which it has originally thrown itself.